Maybe your PhD literature review feels messy because you don't yet have a structure for making sense of what you've already read. That really matters when you're doing a thematic literature review. What I want to help you do is stop reading new literature for a while, okay? There's plenty of time for that later, and instead focus on making sense of what you've already read. The problem isn't usually that you haven't read enough. The problem is you've not yet worked out what you're trying to understand. In this 4-part series, I'm going to help you get your PhD literature review into a really good shape. Now, it is not going to be finished and polished and ready to submit and all lovely, because that is not going to happen until a few weeks before you hand the thing in. But I'm going to help you get it a lot better than it is now, because you're going to get way more strategic in terms of what you're doing with the literature. Let's be honest here. You could keep reading forever, right? You could just keep collecting PDFs and putting them in that PDF graveyard that you've got, whether that's on your desktop or in a folder somewhere. Yeah, I know all about that. So let's move away from the collecting and the harvesting and the hoarding of literature, and let's be much more intentional about interpreting it and synthesizing it and actually making it work for you. Because that is what your PhD examiner is looking for. Speaking as a former PhD examiner myself, I was always way more convinced by a PhD thesis that did a really deep dive into relevant literature than I was by one that had clearly just stuffed a lot of papers and a lot of books in the hope that volume would just get them extra points, and it doesn't. It's not about how many references you can accumulate, okay? It's what you do with the literature you've got. Let's get into the video. Let's start this first video with the big question. If you've read so much already, why does your literature review still feel like a mess? Firstly, I want to reassure you of something. This is completely normal. In fact, I would be really surprised if your literature review didn't feel messy for most of your PhD journey. I'm always a little bit suspicious of people who claim, yeah, my literature review's fine, all good. The reason for this is that I know, after 20 years supporting qualitative researchers through their PhDs, that everyone's PhD goes through a phase or many phases of being not fine. Because the literature review is an exercise in critical thinking, and critical thinking is really messy. And your literature review is going to reflect that for most of your PhD journey. Because the deeper you get into your topic, the further along you go, the more aware you become of all of the complexities and nuances of the literature around your area. And with this, the more complex your thinking becomes, the more jumbled it becomes, particularly if you're doing qualitative research. Someone in Momentum, my PhD community, had this realization recently, and they said it was like being given permission to have a messy literature review, and they felt like that was just such a relief because they felt they'd been having to hide this messy, unstructured, clumsily worded collection of various different documents for quite a while. Interestingly, after they had this realization, they felt really relieved and it took the pressure off. And then the work that they started to do on their literature review became just much more intentional and much more focused. So I think this is something that can be quite powerful for people who are at this stage where they've got something that feels like a real mess and they think that that is some kind of reflection on how good or not they are at this. And it really isn't. It's the way literature reviews are. Let me give you an example. Imagine I'm doing a qualitative study exploring the experiences of women in the UK who leave professional careers in their 40s to start their own online education business. Yeah, ask me how I came up with this example. So I begin reading. I find some literature on female entrepreneurship, And then I realise I need to understand career change. Then I might come across work on midlife transitions, maybe some stuff on identity, a bit of literature on digital entrepreneurship, then some broader stuff about women and work, then self-employment, then adult learning, then confidence and feelings of imposter syndrome, and then the whole work-life balance thing. And before I know it, I've got 50 PDFs, I've got 6 notebooks full of notes, and absolutely no idea what I'm trying to say. I just feel really overwhelmed. I'm drowning in the literature. Does that sound familiar? If so, let me know in the comments what kind of topics came up during your reading binge. I would love to know about the various rabbit holes you've been down, and everybody else would like to know about that too, so get typing down there. This is what happens to so many PhD researchers. And at first, all of this reading can feel really productive. It feels like a good thing to do, and I hear so many supervisors saying to their PhD researchers, read more, read a bit more. You should always be reading when you're studying for a PhD. If you're not reading, then you're not doing the work properly. So you're like, yeah, I'll be a good little PhD researcher and I will just keep reading. And obviously, reading is great. Reading is absolutely vital when you're doing your PhD because it's the way that you learn. It's the way that you gather information and immerse yourself in the field and become aware of the conversations that are going on around you. But what will sometimes happen is PhD researchers will go and read so much stuff and then they'll sit down to write and they're like, ugh. Everything feels kind of disconnected and you can't really remember what a lot of those papers actually said. And if you've already started writing some of it up, you don't want to get rid of it and you adopt this just in case mentality. I should keep this just in case this matters, just in case this is important, just in case my examiner pulls me up on it. And therein lies the problem. This just in case thing is because you don't know what belongs in your literature and what doesn't. And sometimes this can lead to more reading because you think the reason that you don't know what belongs in there and what doesn't belong in there is because you don't know enough. So you go and read more. Reading more is often an attempt to escape the uncertainty. Yes, have you ever heard of procrastinating reading? That's what we're dealing with here. Reading gives us something to do. It feels productive. It feels like a legitimate activity. It feels like something we should be doing. And that goes back to all of those supervisors who tell their students they just need to keep reading the whole time. But if you've got a desktop full of PDFs and pages of notes on the things that you've read, reading one more thing or a few more things is not suddenly going to make your understanding clear. Let's go back to our example study. At this stage, I might think, maybe I need more papers on female entrepreneurship, or perhaps I need to read more about online business, or maybe another paper on identity. But the problem isn't usually that I haven't read enough. The problem is that I haven't worked out what it is I'm trying to understand. That's where your focus needs to be right now, on what you're trying to understand. So, am I trying to understand how women experience career change in midlife, how professional identities are reconstructed, how people build online businesses, how gender shapes entrepreneurial experiences? At this point, I don't have a reading problem. I have a thinking problem. I have a sense-making problem. And this is where qualitative research can feel really uncomfortable. You're trying to identify patterns, ideas, relationships. You're trying to figure out what matters and why it matters. And all of this stuff takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. It requires thinking. It requires you exercising your own judgment and, more importantly, learning to trust that judgment. There isn't a paper or a book out there that can do that thinking for you. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, I genuinely haven't done enough reading yet. That's okay. I'm not saying that you should never read another paper, but I would encourage you to pause and ask yourself these questions before you read anything else. What am I actually trying to understand right now? What feels unclear or messy? What ideas, concepts, or questions keep appearing in the literature I've already read? These questions move you away from collecting information and towards making sense of it. And this is where the real work of the literature review actually begins. Because your literature review is about showing that you understand what matters for your study and that you can build an argument around that. And if your literature review currently feels like a complete mess, that means that you're in the middle of trying to make sense of something complex. And a lot of the PhD journey is that. It is making sense of something complex. Let me ask you something. If I was to say to you, what are you trying to understand at this point in your literature review? What would you say to me? Not what you're reading about, but what you're trying to understand. I genuinely love to know, so get typing down in the comments, and I'm sure there will be some very common themes in there. In the next video, we're going to return to our example study and we're going to look at how the pieces connect together in your literature review. I'll see you in there.